Hello, everyone. We're going to ask everyone to take their seats so that we can start fabulous sessions. A moment to sit down and get settled. I hope Good morning, and welcome to the first panel of the 2023 AAMC conference. I'm so pleased to be here in person to welcome those who are and virtually online. My name is Beth Moore, Manuscripts at the Getty Museum, Governance and Nominating of the AAMC. This year's conference is centered on the concept of empowerment. Fittingly, our first panel is devoted to the theme of curating across between as curators to become siloed in our individual departments instead of harnessing cross-collecting areas. This increasingly seen practice both challenges and dismantles our own curatorial claims to knowledge and ownership, as you probably read in your socio on this today, will reflect on their experiences working across departments to mount pioneer institutions, and it is my pleasure to introduce them. My colleague and friend, Dr. Andrea Acci, and moderator of the panel. She is assistant curator in the Department of Medieval Art at the Met. She is trained as a Byzantinist and specializes in the art and archaeology of late antiquity with a particular interest in illuminated manuscripts and ceramics. We are all eagerly looking forward to her upcoming exhibition, Africa and Byzantium, scheduled to open at the Met on the year. Achille Tomasino, a modern contemporary art at the Met, is co-organizer of the panel and will be joined. Previously, he held curatorial positions at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and a former Fulbright Fellow, of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, will be joining Andrea and Achille in today's panel. At the Philadelphia Museum, she helps oversee the collection of decorative arts from Europe after 1700 and the museum's global design collection, while she completes her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. She is currently organizing an exhibition about the enduring legacy of 20th century designs for the prevention and treatment of diseases such as tuberculosis and the great influenza pandemic. I'm sorry that travel difficulties mean that Marita N. Poole, Executive Director of the Newcomb Art Museum, unfortunately can't be with us as originally planned. But please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you. And Achille, I think you can start.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank everyone in attendance and express my gratitude to the AAMC and AAMC Foundation staff, including Executive Director Judith Pinero and Lucy Leiden of Luce Productions. Thanks also to my co-panelists. I especially thank my colleague, Dr. Andrea Acci, who is both the co-organizer and moderator of this panel on curating crossover between departments and co-curator of the exhibition that inspired our proposal to organize this panel. Could you go to the next slide? Sorry, I can't see it. Is this the title slide for the exhibition? Great. On view at the Met from January 29, 2024 to January 5th, 2026, Afterlives, Contemporary Art in the Byzantine Crypt is a collection-based exhibition integrating modern and contemporary works into the display of Byzantine Egyptian funerary art and artifacts in the Mary and Michael Jaharis Byzantine Egyptian Gallery. The exhibition will showcase objects from a variety of religious and cultural traditions that reckon with death and envision the afterlife. It will not be an anthropological survey of funerary art, nor will its approach to death and grief be considered macabre. The Byzantine crypt's display of liturgical and secular jewelry, textiles, ivory objects, vessels, and architectural sculpture from early Christian and Coptic monastic sites will be complemented and enriched by modern and contemporary collection objects that serve similar memorial, reliquary, and apotropaic functions. So I will briefly discuss a few object pairings indicative of the various strategies we're employing to reconcile art and artifacts from vastly different cultures and eras. Next. Amplifies the relevance and compelling nature of the funerary portrait across time. So this is a type of pairing in our exhibition that consists of two objects of the same genre from different periods. Next slide. Among other themes, the pairings and groups of Byzantine and contemporary art works is similarly negotiate multiple belief systems and their manifestation in syncretic mortuary art. This likely 5th century Coptic tunic with Dionysian ornament is an example of funerary clothing stained with secretions from the body enshrouded. Cuban-American artist Ana Mendietta's painting on bark paper from her Amantegram series entitled The Vivification of the Flesh from 1981 evokes an anthropomorphic pictogram radiating with life. This pairing juxtaposes different types of objects, one an ancient functional garment, the other contemporary icon that both convey the hope of life after death. Next slide. This next pairing exemplifies how our installation will evoke the exhibition's themes. So Mel Edwards' 1988 sculptural relief, Ready Now, from his Lynch Fragment series, will be hung across a narrow bay from the 6th to 7th century fragment of a frieze with the miracle of the loaves and fishes that was effaced by iconoclasts. The proximity of the sharp head of the hoe in the welded steel sculpture to the vandalized marble frieze will viscerally evoke the violence of the intentional chipping away of the devotional image. Next slide. So I conclude with another example of how installation is both key to unifying and amplifying this trans-historical thematic exhibition. We will be installing Adrian Piper's powerful edition work, Everything #4, which is etched with gold lettering that reads, "Everything will be taken away," in the central nave of the gallery. The mirror and its text present the persistence of impermanence and would compel our visitors to personally confront the central themes of the exhibition. We will also be installing 4 additional editions of the work in spaces throughout the Met and the cloisters. In these other galleries, the mirrors will reflect and transform their context, provoking visitors to contemplate how those collections in those sections intersect with the aphorism and inviting them to visit Afterlives, Contemporary Art in the Byzantine Crypt. I hope you all have the opportunity to view this unprecedented collaboration between the departments of medieval art in the cloisters and modern and contemporary art at the Met. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Childs, and I work at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to AAMC for inviting me here today. So I'm just going to show a couple of slides to give you a sense of a few of the projects that I've been working on recently with my colleagues at the Philadelphia Museum of Art before we move into the discussion. So next slide, please. So this is a recent reinstallation of one of our most important period rooms, a drawing room designed by Robert Adam in the 1760s. It's on the third floor of the museum, and this was a collaborative project between my department, European Decorative Arts, and our European Paintings department at the museum. In terms of reinstalling it. And the big sort of transformation here was that we actually had a replica carpet made according to the original designs of Robert Adam in the 1760s, and we're able to sort of open the room up and allow visitors to walk into the space. And one of the things that came out of working collaboratively with my European paintings colleagues was that we completely redid all of the interpretive material and all of the labels and rewrote them in a way to really reflect a more inclusive story about Britain's role, political role in the 18th century. And we wanted to specifically acknowledge some of the ways that Britain's policies and colonial exploits had impacted people in different parts of the globe, and wanted to point out how you saw that reflected in some of the objects and materials that are used in the room. So for example, the doors in this room are made out of mahogany. Those were likely harvested by enslaved people. So we were drawing attention to those kinds of stories and ways of looking at the objects that previously in the room we had not touched upon. And that kind of research is something that we're continuing with colleagues in my department, European Decorative Arts, European Paintings, and our American Art department. We're working collaboratively on a large research sort of based project to look at all of the objects in our British galleries and also in objects in our American Art department and their connections with the transatlantic slave trade, either objects that depict sitters or people who were enslavers, objects that were perhaps purchased with sources of wealth that came from the transatlantic slave trade, or also connections to the abolitionist movement. So this is an ongoing cross-departmental research project. And once we have the findings and the information, we will use that not only in our interpretive labels, but also to mount a series of installations. And one of the things that we would like to do is to engage contemporary artists, especially Black British artists, to help sort of speak to some of these themes about Britain and empire, not only in the 18th century, but what that means today, in Britain and in a world that is rapidly changing and is very diverse and multicultural. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is another example of a collaboration between multiple departments at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We reinstalled our 19th century European art galleries. It was a multi-year project that was primarily a collaboration between European Paintings and European Decorative Arts, but we also worked with colleagues in other departments across the museum, including our East Asian department and our Costume and Textiles department. And one of the primary goals in reinstalling the works was not only to do some gallery upgrades, some infrastructure upgrades, but we really wanted to present a kind of integrated approach or an integrated picture of art in the 19th century so that there would be dialogues between the paintings, the decorative arts, sculpture, and textiles. And so here you're seeing one gallery, which is the theme of it is really examining how European artists were influenced by the art and objects that were circulating in Europe during the 19th century, coming from Japan and China specifically. And one of the things that we really focused on here was including representative objects from our East Asian department, so that rather than simply presenting the European objects and saying, they were looking to Asia, we could actually show objects that were representative of the kinds of styles or the kinds of things that they might have seen. We not only wanted to talk about the kind of story of Europe looking to East Asia, but we also had examples of objects that would allow us to talk about the transmission of ideas going in the other direction as well. So this was looking at East Asian artists who were perhaps going to Paris and studying new painting techniques that they could then incorporate into their art back in Japan, for example, or in one case we have a figurine depicting Sadayako, who was a Japanese kabuki, the first female Japanese kabuki theater performer in Paris, who created a sensation. She learned Western theater techniques and incorporated that into her own performances, and then went back to Japan and taught those techniques to other Japanese performers. So this was it involved 4 different departments in just this gallery alone to create these kinds of juxtapositions and these dialogues between objects that you see here. And the next slide, please. So this is an installation project that I'm currently working on, and it's one of several interventions, or I could say insertions, in our historical galleries on the 3rd floor. And what I'm doing is we have in my department a wonderful collection of work by contemporary designers and artists, including Black designers, and we're actively growing that part of the collection. And so I'm working to create conversations between some of those recent acquisitions and objects that we have in our galleries, which have been on view for many, many years, just to create conversations, explore new themes, and connect with new audiences. So here, this is one example. You're looking at the left at a period room that we have in our British galleries. It comes from Sutton Scarsdale Hall, which was built in the 1720s, is in Derbyshire in England. This is one of the first rooms actually that was installed in the museum when our building on the Parkway opened in 1928. And you'll see it includes a series of paintings that come from the collection of John Howard McFadden, who was a cotton merchant. And there are several important Gainsborough paintings in this gallery that depict not only the English countryside, but also women wearing their 18th century fashion and 18th century hairstyles. And on the right, you see a ceramic, which we've recently acquired by the South African artist Zizipo Poswa. And she works in Cape Town. She's part of the kind of contemporary landscape of artists in that city, but she grew up in the rural South African countryside. And this piece actually explores her own heritage and her experiences growing up in South Africa. The shape of it, and you see on the top, the vessel next to Zizipo, you can see the scale. It's quite large. It has a presence. The shape of the vessel evokes the practice of Unthwalo that she practiced growing up, or carrying things on her head, water and other items, which she remembers very fondly. So the shape of the vessel is honoring that kind of work that women do in South Africa, and honoring important women in her life. And it comes from a series of vessels which are all named after female mentors. This one's named after her cousin, Amanda. And one of the really notable things, in addition to really interesting texture, she experiments a lot with different glazes. You see on the top this quite dramatic series of loops, of these kind of threaded loops, and that is meant to evoke the hairstyle that her cousin Amanda, how she would wear her hair. So her cousin had dreadlocks, and Zizipo is really speaking to that tradition of Black natural hair and celebrating that. And Zizipo herself was a hair model at one point, and she changes her hair very frequently and sort of celebrates the natural texture of her hair and the possibilities of what it can do. So this piece specifically is speaking to that and speaking to Black beauty and celebrating natural Black hair. And so what I wanted to do here was to put that piece in conversation with the Gainsborough portraits that you see, which also are very much about hairstyle, but centered this conversation about, ideas of beauty and Black beauty. And it seems particularly relevant, especially at a time when we have legislation in the United States that has been passed in several states, but has not been passed at a federal level, which protects Black Americans and their right basically to wear their hair naturally without any legal repercussions. So this is one example of several of these kinds of insertions in the galleries that I'm currently working on.
Thank you so much. So for this part of the conversation, we're just going to discuss the challenges and opportunities of working across departments. We are all working within encyclopedic museums, but our institutions are so different. And because but depending on the institution, your scholarly expertise seems to straddle between departments, right? I'm wondering how you navigated aligning your expertise, like what you wrote your dissertation on, with your curatorial purview.
Yeah, so my dissertation and my academic training is sort of in late 19th and early 20th century architecture and design and decorative arts. My dissertation is looking at Germany and France in the early 20th century and sort of cross-pollination between designers and artists working in Germany and France, coming from the Bauhaus and coming from other French schools of thought. But I feel very, very privileged to work at my institution and to work in the department that I'm in because I have a lot of other interests. And at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, our European Decorative Arts and Sculpture department has a broad range of objects in it. So our collection starts with medieval decorative arts and sculpture, includes Italian and French Renaissance, Baroque, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and moves into the present. And we have a global design collection, which includes not only design from Europe, but also the United States, Africa, Latin America, and we're continuing to grow that. So it's a real joy to be able to have that space where I can work with my colleagues in my department and in other departments to really create the kinds of conversations that you saw I'm thinking about. We also have Arms and Armor, another example of a project that I'm working on now and I'm excited about is a kind of dialogue between contemporary design and Arms and Armor in our collection. So I was working with our Arms and Armor curator. We had recently acquired a 16th century German print book by Hans Kreuzberger, a very rare book that depicted examples of horse bridles and bits and other equipment that could be used as a kind of pattern book for makers. And these are very rare. There are not a lot of examples of these. And we also know very little about the people that were making these kinds of objects. Kreuzberger himself was a spur maker and worked in Augsburg. But I thought it could be a really fruitful exercise opportunity to put that new acquisition in conversation with a design by a very famous and perhaps not well known at all horse trainer and a horse designer of horse equipment named Tom Bass, who was born into slavery in the 19th century and became very well known during the 19th century, trained horses for 5 different US presidents, was invited by Queen Victoria to perform at her Jubilee. And he he was African American, which is remarkable that he had this career during that time. But he designed a bit which is still used today. It's kind of ubiquitous. Every barn will have one of these training bits, including this is our Philadelphia connection to Black equestrian culture. Our Concrete Cowboys, the Fletcher Street Urban Riding Club, which is in Western Philadelphia, which is a historic African-American riding club and is the focus of the movie with Idris Elba, Concrete Cowboys. But taking the bit that Tom Bass designed and creating a display around the art of training horses and looking at how, and this bit too was pretty revolutionary in terms of moving people away from sort of pain deterrence or designs that for horses that were intended to communicate with the horses through pain to something that was gentler. And I think that this kind of installation is useful to highlight the book, but also to connect with our visitors in Philadelphia, especially. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, I find exciting about doing this kind of work is, that we can in Philadelphia, we're a majority Black city, and I think these kinds of cross dialogues across different kinds of objects really can connect to visitors and help them to understand, a German print book from the 16th century, to make that sort of relevant and to highlight another kind of story that that people may not know about.
Absolutely. At the Met, we have a Coptic textile with some Black mounted riders. So if you want to borrow that, you can.
I did. That would be great.
Cross-departmental collaboration. So Achille, so as you know, there's a recent trend of bringing contemporary works into historical exhibitions. So sometimes that's juxtapositions, other times it's codas. What do you think the future might be in these types of contemporary / historical collaborations?
I think
you're muted.
of these collaborations. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the most successful of these collaborations involve contemporary artists who are deeply vested in the historical topics. So I think that, as the trend continues, they'll become more and more nuanced and deeply connected to deeply connecting the tissue of the materials. Also, I think silos are being broken down in institutions as curators, like our projects cross more and more boundaries. So I just anticipate more creativity and silo breaking in the future, especially as contemporary artists become more involved in the production of these exhibitions.
Yeah. Well, kind of building on that, how does working in an encyclopedic museum inform your curatorial practice? I know you're working on another exhibition that spans different genres and collections as well. Are there challenges working at an institution with so many curatorial departments, or do you find it just to be an opportunity?
I think the opportunities certainly outweigh the challenges of working in a large encyclopedic institution. I'm really energized by being in an environment with people who have so many different knowledge areas, and there's potential for so many serendipitous points of collaboration. For instance, the show that we were working on together came about because of an opportunity that you had in a gallery that is under your purview, and you invited me to think collaboratively with you to propose a project for the space. And that's something I couldn't have anticipated coming into the Met. I think I've also always been deeply interested in asking questions of art that aren't necessarily bound to the period of my own specialization. So deeper questions about life and the function of art in society, and questions that really don't have any sort of temporal limits, like even the topic of our project, which is death, which is a perennially relevant issue and something that artists across all periods and contexts think about.
Thank you. So for you, what do you think the future holds for departments of European art or decorative arts? Like, do you think that in the future the silos are going to break down and we're going to use different terms, or are we going to double down on these terms and continue the silos, but then just think about better ways of working across departments? Like, what's an ideal situation for you?
Do you mean terms like European decorative arts as a department name? Well, I mean, that's a good question. I can't speak to, all the other institutions, but I know certainly at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I hope elsewhere too, that this trend of, sort of collaborative work, moving across departments will continue. I think it's more important than ever, especially in a world where we have new young generations of museum visitors who are walking through the world in a different way than their parents, than their grandparents, and I think that we as museum professionals have to appreciate that and think about how we're presenting our collections in a way that connects and resonates with them, and I think especially that this kind of cross-departmental work is a way to, as Achille mentioned, I mean, I love working with and having conversations with colleagues in different departments because they bring different expertise and can help you look at things through a different lens, and I think it's really important that we have that kind of diversity of thought, so that when we're presenting objects, we're not presenting in the same way and telling the same stories that have always been told. And there are so many stories, I think, and historical narratives that haven't been emphasized, in our art historical universe and in our museums. And I think this kind of cross-departmental work is one way that we can really hone in on some of the overlooked stories and narratives and create more inclusive, historical presentations of the material. I'm excited too, I should say, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we are going to have a new center, the Ira Brin Center, for the study and collection of work by African and Afro-diasporic artists specifically. And I think that at our institution is going to be a really good partner for us to really think about how we can, approach these materials in different ways. And I think especially for European decorative arts, to work with other departments to think about all of the various influences that you see manifest in the arts of Europe, the different global trends that are happening, movement of materials, movement of people, and different artists' ideas that are crossing geographic boundaries. I think those are all things that we can, in European arts departments, really emphasize more, I think. And I think, part of that will come from working with colleagues and thinking about things in creative new ways. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that we talked about as we're preparing for the panel is thinking about what a museum might look like if we started from scratch. And I asked you, like, do you think a new museum would have departments? Like, if we just decided to build something and identified what a collection might look like, and you were thinking about it then, but I wondered if you have an answer. And then Achille, also for you, like, should museums have departments? And if not, what would a structure look like without silos?
I mean, it's such a hard question because, I've worked at a few different museums that are, different sizes, have different scales. And of course, as we all know, a lot of collections and departments and the way the departments are configured, it's the result of sometimes, particular gifts or collections that come from specific donors at certain times, or perhaps the particular collecting interests of one curator at a particular moment. That's certainly true in my departments, the way my department has been configured. But it's definitely hard. I mean, when I think about my own department and the kind of range of materials that we have, as you mentioned at one point, at other institutions where, my department might actually be 4 different departments, because of the kinds of objects that we have. And so starting from scratch, I mean, I think it is useful to have some kind of structure, but certainly perhaps different names for departments. It's something to think about, whether we would want to use the arts of Europe or a different way of categorizing. Yeah, I don't know.
Very good question. Makes me think of the several institutions I know of, but they're mostly exclusively focusing on 20th and 21st century art that simply have curatorial departments where there isn't necessarily further specialization within a fairly well-defined time period. So I could see a trend to breaking down some of the silos, particularly of medium-specific departments, to focus more on periods, especially because artists innovative ways. And I think it's interesting to think about starting from scratch, but I also feel that given the years of dedication to developing a specialty, it is nice to sort of firmly sit in one area and intentionally reach across an aisle to engage with something that is completely different from your intellectual formation and knowledge of a specific area. But I would like to turn some of these questions back on you, Andrea, and I'm curious your thoughts on working in an encyclopedic museum and having pursued, even before our collaboration, other transhistorical and cross-departmental projects. Informs your curatorial perspective and your method of thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, I'm a Byzantinist in my collection. I have about 4,000 objects that span 1,000 years that cross really different continents, objects from North Africa and Europe and Western Asia. But I'm in the medieval department, and sometimes I think about how my 4th century rock crystal from Carthage doesn't really relate to the 15th century French Gothic sculpture that's also within my department. And so I consider my collection to be almost a department within a department. And because of that, and because of some of those restrictions, I feel like I'm also a little bit freer to work with other colleagues in different departments, like Islamic art, Asian art, and African art, for example, because the types of conversations I have with my colleagues within my own department, right, is similar to the conversation I have with colleagues outside of the department. And because of that, I've been able to do really kind of creative things within my permanent collection space. So for example, under the stairs at the Met, there's a space called the Byzantine Crypt that Achille mentioned, and about 75% of the objects in that space are from the Islamic department because they're early Christian material that's under their purview. And I have to request those objects every time I do a rotation and do real formal interdepartmental loan request. But because I'm constantly doing that, I feel almost encouraged to do that with other departments like Asian art. And I think that the fact that my purview is so almost eclectic has allowed me to do this for like larger exhibitions. So for my African Byzantium exhibition, it's about 1/3 meta objects, and I have objects from African art and Islamic art and also Asian art. And my department head asked me, well, how do you feel the fact that we have this medieval exhibition and we have all of these objects from different collections? But this is the work that I've already been doing, right, within my permanent collection. So it's very natural to do that. And so sometimes I have to like kind of step back and realize that not all of our colleagues are working in this way. And so I think that's a challenge, because to me, when someone walks into the Met, they don't realize that maybe this object is not a part of the medieval department, or that, jewelry over there is actually Islamic. They're not looking at it the same way that we look at these objects within an institution. And so, I think that's a challenge, because there's different departments where people feel a little bit more protective of their works. And I feel like this is the Met's objects. Like, we should all just, move things around. I'm really looking forward to the future of institutions, because I think that we're all encouraged to collaborate more. We're encouraged to talk more. And one great thing about pandemic is that we have been more comfortable having like these face-to-face conversations. And like, it's easier. Face-to-face meaning like Zoom conversation, you can see people. And I think that this is going to allow people to collaborate not only within their institutions, but across different museum spaces. And 20 years from now, what a museum look like? I think that both like the curators and the visitors will experience objects in very different ways than we did previous generation. Obviously, but I'm really optimistic about the future of our work. So
Can I say one other thing that touches on something Achilles said, and then you said too, about how visitors are like looking at all of this? And yeah, they don't walk into a gallery and say, okay, this is European, this is paintings, this is a print, this is, to be able to see everything together, I think is really important. But I've also, in working on the contemporary side as well, and working with a lot of contemporary designers, I've noticed that, as Achilles mentioned this, in their own work, they're not thinking about our curatorial silos, and their work really straddles, the line between the different departments. So we have these conversations, at my institution all the time about, the kind of gray space between craft and design. And we have a craft curator, and we also have and support for craft, and we also have design, which is in my department. And many of the designers that I work with, their art, they incorporate craft into their design practice. They also, in many ways are, thinking about fine art, and their work, really encapsulates all of that. And so sometimes, when thinking about where does this go in the museum, or even, which conservator, is assigned to it, I think in the future, especially in the contemporary space, that's going to help, just by the nature of the works that are coming in, the way the artists are thinking about it. And many of them are deliberately, trying to break down these silos, and others, it's just, the direction that their work is taking them in. And I think in the future, we'll see that, I hope, reflected in our institutional, our current, siloed structures, that will help to break them down. But
absolutely. So we can take some questions for the next couple of minutes if there's any questions from the audience. I think you can come, yeah.
Thank you. That was a really great contextualization of some of the ways that you all have been working in interdisciplinary ways. And I know that's been happening for a while now at some of your institutions, and probably many of ours. One question I have is, I'm curious to get your response on a model that could be one potential solution, I think, to some of this interdisciplinary work, which is the secondment, the notion of like a temporary post in either another institution or another department while still maintaining one's position, which I think is something that is used in other fields, but I do know a few people within the art world who have taken advantage of secondments. And I think oftentimes when I've seen it happen, it's within different institutions, but especially at an institution like the Met or PMA, I wonder if that, you know, the reappointment of a curator within another department for a temporary time period might be a way to create additional synergy. And have you all seen that model being used at all? And what are your reactions to it as a potential for new conversations, or what are the problematics of it?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I certainly personally haven't done a secondment, but I have colleagues who have done that at other institutions, who have gone overseas to work at or have secondments at European institutions and have residencies there. And I think, you know, it's always extremely informative to see, you know, the internal practices of another institution, how you know, they're structuring their work, how they work across their different departments. The idea of having a secondment or a reappointment within one's own institution, I think at a place like the PMA, the size of the museum, I mean, we already are pretty collaborative in the way we meet. We have 8 curatorial departments and around 25, 28 curators. And we do already have a number of different curatorial working groups, you know, that meet on different topics. So one, for example, is a contemporary art working group, because we have a contemporary art department, but there are a number of other departments across the museum that engage with contemporary material or sometimes stage contemporary shows, my department included. And we meet regularly to have those conversations. So, you know, for instance, I don't know in my case if it would be helpful to have me or one of my colleagues in my department who works on contemporary design be stationed in, you know, a contemporary art department or a craft department, since we're already having those discussions. Maybe at other institutions with a maybe a bigger scale, like maybe the Met might be a place where it could be useful. But I do like the idea of having a secondment. For example, if I were to be stationed in a different institution and maybe, you know, be in a craft department or an American art department, I would be interested actually to have that opportunity. So I like that. I can't think of any examples. Can you, where this is already being done, I guess?
Yeah, well, the Met, there's been new positions that have been created where people straddle between departments. So, for example, our colleague Denise Morel has, she's based in the director's office, but she also goes to department meetings and European art and then also modern contemporary. And so I think that might also be a model, because her curatorial purview spans what's actually in the Met's collection, and it's more about the ideas that she's bringing to the institution. And I'm hoping that that will also be a model in the future. I think doing curatorial hires that don't always aren't always a direct report to a department head, but maybe a direct report to someone within the administration, and thinking a little bit more holistically about the projects that they're working on. And Achille, you're working on a cross-departmental book right now, the Met as well.
Yeah, there are many different ways we work collaboratively at the Met. There's also the forum for curators, conservators, and missing the third component of that. But within the forum, there are committees that I serve on the scholarship committee with colleagues in conservation and in other curatorial departments. I like the idea of secondmency. I haven't seen it implemented within museums in my experience, but I generally think that it's good for curators in particular to have experience with and knowledge of how other fields work, how other departments work, even and especially within their own institutions, because processes vary differently. Approaches to things like acquisitions vary quite widely. So it's all mutually beneficial to learn as much as possible about how things with other departments.
Yeah, I guess The Center for Curatorial Leadership has, I don't know if it's exactly this kind of cross-departmental appointment, but certainly placing curators in different institutions to benefit from learning exactly those kinds of processes and how things work. I think is one example, but.
Thanks so much. I really loved all the projects that you guys mentioned. And certainly in my department in manuscripts at the Getty, we've been very interested to introduce contemporary art, cross-media into the galleries. I was wondering if you could talk, all three of you, about two different aspects. One is, in your museums, was this sort of a directive that came back from above, or was this a groundswell from underneath and you had to create buy-in in upper administration? So about how that worked. And the second thing is, the one thing that we found in our department is that, you know, as Andrea mentioned, you know, I hope that wasn't me, but when you do this kind of work, you do create work across the museum. Registrars have to get involved, preps have to get involved, conservation in different departments. So it does create extra work around the museum on top of everyone doing all the things they've always done. So how do you balance that, being sensitive to coworkers in other departments having to get involved in these kinds of things in the past when they haven't had to do that so much? And a lot of people, you know, are overburdened at the moment. So those two questions.
Yeah, I can start because for your first idea that came from Max Holine when he started at the Met in 2018, because he wanted the curators to talk to each other more. And he identified three spots at the Met that were like literal crossroads, like, meaning there was high traffic areas. And one of those spots was the Medieval Sculpture Hall. And if you go to the Medieval Sculpture Hall now, you'll see that a lot of people don't stop there. It's the crossroads of the Met, where you need to go past it in order to get to the cafeteria or to the American Wing or to another place in the Met. And all of our sculptures in that sculpture hall are on the walls, and it was always like just like a thoroughfare. And so he asked us to think about what the medieval period is and perhaps use different objects from the 5th to the 15th century across the museum and then place it in the middle of the sculpture hall. So that's how the idea came about. And then, but for this project that Achille and I are working on, it's basically on our personal connections and just conversations that we have about our own work. And you're right, it has caused more work for other departments, because each department is basically its own institution. We have our collections managers and registrars within our own department. So when you're working across departments, you're almost doubling the work. And there was a question of like, do we need a registrar for this? Do we have to have formal loan request from medieval department to contemporary department in order to do this exhibition? And there's been so many more meetings for the small, tiny installation than usual, like the usual rotations that we have. And this is a question: is this type of work sustainable? Is this, you know, what are the priorities for the institutions and for the departments? And I mean, I hope that we can find a way that it becomes sustainable. And I don't have the answer for that right now, but I do know it becomes frustrating for some colleagues because they have their priorities within departments in terms of like acquisitions and different other projects, bigger projects, and these small projects with, you know, 15 objects on the checklist, like it takes a while to actually implement them. And so I think these are part of the questions for the future of these types of collaborations.
Yeah, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, this kind of collaborative work, I think, has always been part of the way the curators have operated. I'm relatively new, but I can see examples, and I see how my colleagues who have been at the institution for many years have thought about working across these silos and really been quite experimental and innovative in how they've put displays together. So there already is kind of, the groundwork for that kind of work at the PMA. And I know it's something that moving forward, our leadership wants us to continue. And as I mentioned, I think centers like the Brin Center are really going to be, help us to continue that kind of cross-departmental work. And it's regarding the labor involved, it's a very real thing, and collections managers, registrars making official requests between departments. As you mentioned, each department has its own kind of staff. And for us, one of the things that we had to think about, especially, the 19th Century Gallery project that I mentioned, where we have so many different mediums and they're coming from different departments, textiles and works on paper, which have different conservation requirements and are, light sensitive. It means that we have to think far ahead in terms of the planning of which objects we're going to rotate in and at what point. And it's a lot of work for people across the institution. And I think one thing for us is keeping in mind why we're doing this and what as an important motivating sort of factor, and how, and also seeing how at the end of the day it's a lot, but seeing how it lends new ways of looking at these works to our visitors, to see them walk into like our East Meets West gallery and be able to see our famous Whistler painting next to a cabinet that was made in Japan and shown in Philadelphia in 1876 at the Centennial Exhibition, I think is kind of critical for us. So as you mentioned, there are sometimes logistical sort of hurdles, but it's important work. So
yeah, absolutely.
It's just reinforcing what Andrea said with regard to the first question. This project that we're working on is a purely organic collaboration out of discussions we had about mutual interests. And I think we have the fortune that Max Holine has prioritized cross-departmental collaboration in his sort of approach to being a director, and is interested in facilitating avenues of collaboration across departments. So it coincides with our independent pursuit of this joint project, which made it easier to push the project through because it coincides with priority of the administration of the institution in our case. And to this second part of the question, challenges of increasing labor across departments, certainly, as both Alicia and Andrea said, work can double, but at the same time, I've found that the collaboration can be mutually reinforcing of priorities that are independent within the departments. So for instance, this particular collaboration might facilitate an acquisition that I would be interested in pursuing with the temporary department in any case, but has the support and reinforcement of being of interest and having a direct use in this upcoming collaboration with the medieval department. Moreover, I found that all of the contemporary artists that are involved, whose work will be in this project, are extremely keen to be recontextualized in this way, and to have their work seen in a new light in conversation with medieval works. And that has a sort of intangible benefit to the contemporary department in deepening our relationship with these artists and amplifying how we think about them and present their work.
Thank you. So I see the red sign up, but there's still one more. What yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm interested in knowing if you partnered with departments outside of curatorial, and I'm thinking more specifically programming, but I'm wondering if there have been other non-curatorial partnerships and what that has looked like. Thank you.
Yes, well, in my case, I'm very interested in working with departments outside curatorial as well to kind of highlight these stories. So our retail shop is one, working with contemporary designers, for example, who can kind of extend the work that we're displaying in the gallery by, making products perhaps specifically for our shops. We have a number of new acquisitions in the collection and that I'm excited about, and these designers are going to be partnering with our shops. That's one way. Certainly outside partners as well, to have programming that furthers the ideas that we're trying to get across in the galleries. Simple things or events, working with our education department. So like one example is, which I would like to do this, is including more performance, for example, and not just dance or song, but also spoken word, as a way to, and poetry, to have a way to, have especially young people in Philadelphia interact with and respond to some of the themes that we're exploring. So this theme that I discussed of, Black beauty and Black hair and what that means. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of hopes and have started working on a number of collaborations beyond our curatorial departments in the museum and with outside partners as well.
I could go on for 15 more minutes about collaborating with other departments, especially the conservation, education, colleagues, retail, and so many more. But I think that our time here is it's done for this session. But I'm really looking forward to this being the start of so many more conversations, and then building on the work that so many of you have already been doing in terms of collaborating across departments. Thank you.
For sharing their experiences collaborating across departments. It is now 12:56. We will be breaking for lunch. We encourage everyone to vacate as the ballroom is closed during lunch. It's a beautiful